The scorching summer sun intensified the dry air in the small town of New Haven, at the entrance to Crystal Ridge. In the improvised laboratory of the Federal University, Professor David Miller, a 50-year-old man with expression lines that revealed his life dedicated to fieldwork, organized his notes. His blue eyes, contrasting with his sunburned skin, scanned the ancient maps of the region. "Professor, the equipment is ready and calibrated," informed Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old veterinarian, while adjusting her wristwatch. Her black hair was tied in a practical ponytail, and her calloused hands evidenced her experience in climbing. "Excellent, Sarah. This expedition could change everything we know about species adaptation in extreme environments," replied David, without taking his eyes off a particularly old map where the name Sentinel Peak appeared surrounded by unknown symbols. On the other side of the room, Michael Crawford, a 40-year-old field doctor, was checking his first aid kit. Tall and with a serene appearance, Michael was known for his calmness in crisis situations. "Are you sure about this region? I've heard strange stories about Sentinel Peak," he commented, briefly looking up. "That's precisely why we're going, Michael. Legends always have an ecological truth at their core," David responded with a confident smile. The laboratory door opened, and Ryan Nakamura entered, an environmental photographer of Japanese descent, carrying his state-of-the-art photographic equipment. At 35, Ryan had already published extensive work on American biomes in international magazines. "Everything's ready with the special night vision cameras, Professor. I also got a lens that captures temperature variations," he said, carefully placing his backpack on the floor. David nodded with satisfaction. The expedition was almost complete. Only the local guide was missing. As if summoned by this thought, a man with tan skin and striking features entered the room. Joseph Barrett, known to everyone as Joe, carried with him not just a deep knowledge of the ridge trails, but also the stories his grandfather, a respected healer, had told him about that place. "Good morning," Joe greeted them with a deep voice. "The supplies are already in the jeep. We can leave at dawn." There was a subtle tension in his voice that didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. "Any problem, Joe?" she asked, approaching him. Joe hesitated, looking directly at the map open on David's table. "Professor, are you sure you want to go to Sentinel Peak? There are other peaks in the ridge with rich and unexplored biodiversity," suggested the guide, avoiding answering Sarah directly. David stood up, facing Joe with curiosity. "You know that region well, don't you? What's there that worries you so much?" The guide ran his hand through his graying hair, visibly uncomfortable. "There are things that science can't explain, Professor. My grandfather used to say that Sentinel Peak is a place where two worlds meet." Ryan let out a laugh. "Local superstitions. Fascinating from an anthropological point of view, but we're not going to let them interfere with our research, right?" Joe looked at Ryan with a seriousness that made the photographer's smile falter. "You laugh because you haven't seen what I've seen. The watch goat is not a legend, it's a warning." A heavy silence fell over the room. Michael was the first to buy. "Break it." "Watch goat? What would that be?" Before Joe could answer, David intervened, placing a hand on the guide's shoulder. "We'll have time for stories during the trip. Now we need to finalize the preparations." But Sarah noticed how the professor's eyes gleamed upon hearing the term watch goat. There was something more to this expedition than the search for new species. She could feel it. David was keeping a secret, and somehow that mountain was part of it. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, the group departed in two jeeps loaded with equipment. As they left the town behind, Sarah observed the landscape gradually changing, the green intensifying on the distant slopes. Beside her, Joe drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road but his mind clearly elsewhere. "Joe," she ventured, "could you tell me about this watch goat?" Joe remained silent for a few moments, his eyes fixed on the road as the jeep advanced through increasingly narrow paths. The imposing rocks of Crystal Ridge were silhouetted against the blue sky, casting mysterious shadows over the vegetation. "My grandfather," he finally began, his voice almost a whisper, "used to say that the Ayabi watch goat only appears to people who are close to the veil." "Veil?" questioned Sarah, intrigued. "A kind of boundary," explained Joe, avoiding a hole in the road. "Not between life and departure, as many think, but between this world and another. A place where time flows differently." In the jeep behind, David observed the animated conversation between Sarah and Joe. Next to him, Ryan checked his cameras while Michael consulted a digital map. "Professor, may I ask you a personal question?" inquired Michael, putting away his tablet. "Why the specific interest in Sentinel Peak?" "Your research mentions high-altitude biodiversity, but there are other peaks that are taller and more accessible." David adjusted his sunglasses, his expression momentarily distant. 20 years ago, a colleague of mine, George Sanders, disappeared during an expedition in this region, he revealed. He was a brilliant climber with a special talent for high-altitude botany. His last contact mentioned extraordinary discoveries at Sentinel Peak. "Do you think we'll find any trace of him?" asked Ryan, now interested in the conversation. "I don't know," admitted David, "but I want to understand what he saw in that place. George wasn't a man of exaggerations, and his last messages spoke of unusual phenomena." The group arrived at a small village at the foot of the mountain as the sun was beginning to set. Simple adobe and wooden houses surrounded a central plaza where children played under the watchful eye of elders seated on rustic benches. Upon noticing the arrival of the outsiders, the residents cast curious glances, some waving to Joe, who was evidently known in the region. A white-haired woman with a face marked by deep wrinkles approached the vehicles. "Joseph Barrett," she called, using the guide's full name. "Are you taking them to Sentinel Peak?" Joe got out of the jeep and embraced the woman with respect. "Mrs. Ruth, they're researchers from the university. They're going to study plants and animals." The old woman examined each member of the group with penetrating eyes that seemed to read far beyond appearances. When her gaze met David's, she narrowed her eyes. "You've been here before," she stated, not as a question but as a fact. "Many years ago," confirmed David, extending his hand, which the lady ignored. "You're looking for him, aren't you?" asked Mrs. Ruth, keeping her gaze fixed on David. "The one the goat took." A heavy silence fell over the group. It was Sarah who broke it. "Ma'am, did you know George Sanders?" The old woman finally shifted her gaze from David to face Sarah. "It's not about knowing or not knowing, my child. It's about who returns and who stays." Without further explanation, Mrs. Ruth turned her back on the group and slowly walked away, leaving them confused. "What did she mean?" asked Michael. Joe sighed deeply. "Let's set up camp over there." He pointed to a flat terrain near a crystalline stream. "Tomorrow we'll start the climb at dawn." While setting up the tents, Sarah noticed how David seemed disturbed since the encounter with the old woman. She approached him as he organized the measuring equipment. "Professor, is there something we need to know about this expedition?" she questioned directly. David stopped what he was doing and looked at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "George was more than a colleague, Sarah. He was my best friend," he confessed. "His last message to me before disappearing mentioned a blue light and a white goat that invited him to follow. At the time I thought it was altitude delirium. And now? Now, after so many similar reports," David hesitated, "I'm not so sure." At night, gathered around a small campfire, Joe prepared a tea with local herbs while telling stories about the region. The starry sky of the ridge formed a magnificent canopy over their heads. "Sentinel Peak has always been respected by the inhabitants here," explained the guide. "Our ancestors said that up there exists a door." "A door to where?" asked Ryan, adjusting his camera to capture Joe's illuminated face against the fire. "To a place where time runs differently," replied the guide. "Where those who enter can return without having aged a day, even after years." Michael let out a nervous laugh. "That sounds like science fiction." "Today's science is yesterday's magic," Joe responded calmly, serving the tea in improvised mugs. "My grandfather said that the watch goat is the guardian of that passage. She chooses who can see the other side." As the conversation continued, Sarah noticed a movement in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. She stood up discreetly and moved away from the group, trying to get a better look. That's when she saw it, two golden eyes shining in the darkness, belonging to a white silhouette that seemed to be observing them with almost human intelligence. "There's something there," Sarah called, pointing into the darkness. The group immediately turned toward the shadows, but when Ryan aimed his flashlight at the indicated spot, there was nothing but rocks and low vegetation. "I'm sure of what I saw," insisted Sarah, her heart racing. A white silhouette with golden eyes. Joe visibly paled, jumping to his feet. His eyes scanned the darkness intensely. "It was her," he murmured, "the watchgoat." "Let's be rational," intervened Michael, always the most skeptical of the group. "It was probably just some wild animal. This region must have many mountain goats." David remained silent, his gaze fixed in the direction Sarah had pointed. There was a tension in his posture that didn't go unnoticed by the veterinarian. "Tomorrow we'll begin the ascent," he finally announced, his voice strangely controlled. "I suggest we rest well." The next morning, while arranging the equipment for the climb, Sarah noticed that her compass was showing inexplicable variations, the needle spinning without finding north. "Professor, something strange is happening." "With the instruments," she called, showing the compass to David. Ryan approached, checking his GPS. "Mine's going crazy too," confirmed the photographer, adjusting the device. "It says we're simultaneously 4,000 feet above sea level and 160 feet below. It must be some mineral interference," explained David, examining the equipment. "This region has rock formations rich in iron and other metals that can affect navigation instruments." Joe, who was organizing climbing ropes nearby, merely shook his head in silence. His countenance was heavy with concern. They began the ascent shortly after, following a trail that wound between spectacular rock formations. Sentinel Peak rose majestically ahead, its steep slopes cut by crevices and small plateaus. "This mountain has a unique geological composition," David explained as they walked. "Preliminary studies suggest the presence of minerals not yet catalogued in its deeper layers." "Is that why you really came, Professor?" questioned Michael. "For the minerals." Before David could respond, a metallic sound cut through the air. The radiation meter that Ryan was carrying began to emit acute beeps in an irregular sequence. "What's happening?" asked the photographer, alarmed. "Let me see," David requested, examining the device. "Strange. It's picking up electromagnetic variations outside the normal pattern." "What do you mean?" inquired Sarah, approaching. "Frequencies that wouldn't normally be detected by this type of equipment," explained the biologist, furrowing his brow, "almost like communication." "Communication?" repeated Michael, incredulous. "Between whom?" David turned off the device with an abrupt movement. "Just an analogy, let's continue." As they advanced, the vegetation became sparser, giving way to an almost lunar landscape of exposed rocks. The wind gained strength, whistling between the stones in a way that sometimes sounded almost like whispered words. "We're close to the first plateau," informed Joe, pointing to a flat formation a few meters above. "We can set up the base camp there." While climbing the last stretch to the plateau, Sarah noticed something strange on one of the rocks. A series of engraved symbols, partially covered by lichens. She stopped to examine them better. "Joe, come see this," she called. The guide approached, his eyes widening as he recognized the symbols. "These are ancient marks," he explained, carefully passing his fingers over the engravings. "My grandfather called them writing of the veil." "Can you read them?" questioned David, joining them, his scientific interest clearly stimulated. "They're not letters to be read, Professor," replied Joe. "They're symbols of protection and warning. This one," he pointed to a spiral with small lines radiating from the center, "represents the passage. And this one," he indicated what looked like a stylized animal with horns, "is the guardian." "The goat," murmured Sarah. At that moment, they heard a dry noise coming from above. They all raised their eyes simultaneously and saw, standing on top of a rock formation, less than 60 feet away, was a completely white goat. Its fur reflected the sunlight with almost supernatural intensity, and its eyes, a deep golden color, seemed fixed on the group. Ryan reacted by instinct, raising his professional camera and firing off a sequence of photos. The goat remained, motionless, as if deliberately posing. "It's her," whispered Joe, his voice trembling. "The watch goat." "Fascinating," murmured David, observing the animal with intense concentration. Possibly an uncatalogued species, adapted to this extreme environment. Michael tried to approach slowly, but as soon as he took the first step, the goat moved. Not abruptly or frightened, but with deliberate grace, it turned around and walked behind a rock, disappearing from sight. "Let's follow it," exclaimed David, already advancing. "Professor, wait!" called Joe, alarmed. "We shouldn't follow the watch goat. She might be testing us." "Testing?" "It's just an animal, Joe," argued Michael, although his tone didn't sound as convinced as his words. The group reached the spot where the goat had disappeared, but there was no sign of the animal. Even more intriguing, the rocky ground showed no footprints or any indication of its passage. "This is impossible," murmured Michael, examining the ground. "She was here seconds ago." Ryan was checking the photos on his digital camera, his face showing growing perplexity. "I can't understand it," said Ryan, his face contorted in an expression of confusion as he showed the camera screen to his colleagues. "All the photos are blurred." The group gathered around the photographer, examining the images. Despite the state-of-the-art equipment and Ryan's professional skill, each photo of the white goat appeared out of focus, as if the animal were in constant motion, even though they had all witnessed its complete immobility. "Could it be some problem with the camera?" suggested Michael, always seeking rational explanations. Ryan shook his head. "Impossible. I tested other shots before and after," he explained, showing perfectly clear photos of the landscape and group. "Only the images of the goat are like this." Joe observed the situation with a knowing look. "The watch goat cannot be captured by machines," he said calmly. "My grandfather said she exists between moments, not within them." "Between moments?" questioned Sarah, intrigued by the expression. How to explain? Joe hesitated, seeking the right words. "It's as if she were simultaneously here and somewhere else. That's why she leaves no footprints. That's why she doesn't appear clearly in photos." David, who had been silent, absorbing every detail, finally spoke. "We need to set up the base camp before nightfall. We'll continue the investigations tomorrow." They settled on the plateau, setting up sturdy tents capable of withstanding the intense winds of the altitude. While organizing the scientific equipment, the electronic devices continued to exhibit anomalous behaviors. Sarah's laptop turned on and off without command. Ryan's radiation meter registered inexplicable peaks, and the communicator radio picked up static interspersed with sounds that resembled distant whispers. During dinner, prepared on a small field stove, the tension was palpable. Michael, normally animated and talkative, remained taciturn. Ryan continued trying to recover the images of the goat on his computer without success. Joe seemed resigned, like someone who had expected all of this. "Professor," called Sarah, breaking the silence, "you mentioned that George Sanders disappeared in this region. Did he leave any record of phenomena similar to what we're experiencing?" All eyes turned to David, who sighed deeply before responding. "Yes, he did," he admitted, pulling from his backpack a leather-bound diary visibly worn by time. "This is George's personal diary. It was sent to me years after his disappearance, found by local shepherds." "And you never mentioned this before?" questioned Michael, with evident indignation in his voice. "Because much of what's written here sounds like," David hesitated, "like delusions. Equipment failures, sightings of a luminous goat, sensations of being watched, recurring dreams of a blue tunnel." "Exactly what we're experiencing," pointed out Sarah. "That's why we're here," confessed David. "Not just for the biological research, but to understand what happened to George, what he discovered on this mountain that made him disappear." Joe, who had been attentive to the conversation, suddenly became tense. "Listen," he whispered. Everyone fell silent. In the distance, clear and unmistakable, they heard the sound of a delicate bell like those used on the necks of domesticated goats. The sound came from a specific direction, the same where they had seen the white goat hours before. "There are no herds at this altitude," informed Joe, his voice low and tense. The bell sounded again, longer this time, almost like a call. "Let's check it out," decided David, getting up and grabbing a powerful flashlight. "Professor, it's already getting dark," warned Michael. "It's dangerous to explore unknown terrain at night." "We'll stay together and won't go far," assured David, his determination evident. "If it really is the same goat, we need to document its behavior." Reluctantly, the group followed David, equipped with flashlights and recording equipment. The sun had already set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly, as is common at ridge altitudes. The sky, however, remained strangely luminous, with a bluish coloration that didn't correspond to the usual purple of twilight. They followed the sound of the bell, which guided them through increasingly intricate rock formations. At a certain point, Sarah noticed that their footprints in the fine dust that covered some areas of the path emitted a brief bluish glow when illuminated by the flashlights. "Look at this," she called, pointing to the phenomenon. Ryan immediately photographed, hand-collected samples of the substrate in small glass vials. "I've never seen anything like this," he commented, intrigued. "It seems like some type of bioluminescence, but activated only by artificial light." As they advanced, the bell became clearer and more rhythmic. Upon rounding a large rock, the group finally glimpsed the source. The white goat was standing on a small elevation, the bell hanging from its neck on a simple leather collar. This time, however, something else caught everyone's attention. Around the goat, the air seemed to shimmer, like the heat effect over asphalt on hot days, but in a circular pattern that surrounded the animal. "It's an optical distortion," murmured Michael, trying to rationalize what he saw. "No," corrected Joe, his voice laden with reverence. "It's the veil thinning." The goat looked directly at the group, its golden eyes reflecting the light of the flashlights with supernatural intensity. Then, deliberately, it moved its head as if indicating a specific direction. A narrow crevice between two gigantic rocks that none of them had noticed before. "She wants us to follow her," affirmed Sarah, taking a step forward. "Wait," interrupted Joe, holding her arm. "The watch goat only shows the way to those who are ready to see." "See what?" questioned Michael. The answer came not from Joe, but from a sudden movement of the goat. The animal took 3 steps toward the crevice and then looked back, as if checking whether the group would follow. Then, with an almost choreographed grace, it disappeared into the darkness between the rocks. "We need to follow it," said David, already moving in the indicated direction. "Professor, this is madness," protested Michael. "Entering an unknown crevice in the dark. It's an unnecessary risk." "George followed," David replied simply, "and I need to know what he found." Before anyone could argue further, Sarah was already beside David, adjusting her climbing equipment. The entrance to the crevice was so narrow that they needed to advance in single file, with their shoulders brushing against the rocky walls. David led the group, followed by Sarah, Ryan, Michael, and finally Joe, who murmured incomprehensible words as he walked, as if reciting some ancient prayer. "Watch your head," warned David, when the ceiling of the passage abruptly lowered. The light from the flashlights created unsettling shadows on the stone walls, where unknown mineral formations twinkled like microscopic stars. "Professor, do you smell that?" asked Sarah, inhaling deeply. "It smells like ozone, like after a storm." Michael, a few steps behind, checked the air quality meter he carried. Normal readings of oxygen and nitrogen, but there's something else the device isn't identifying. As they advanced, the passage began to gradually widen. The sound of their boots echoed strangely, as if the space ahead was much larger than it seemed. The temperature, which should drop with the advancing night and altitude, remained strangely stable. "My watch stopped," Ryan suddenly observed, giving light taps to the device. "And the camera's chronometer, too." One by one, they all checked their watches and electronic devices, confirming that none were working correctly. The hands rotated in opposite directions or remained frozen, while the digital screens displayed random numbers or simply went blank. "Time behaves differently near the veil," explained Joe calmly, as if commenting on the weather. "It's the first sign." Before anyone could question what sign that might be, the passage abruptly ended, opening into a large and surprising space. It was a natural cave of impressive proportions, with a ceiling so high that the flashlights could barely illuminate. It completely. But it wasn't the size of the place that left the group in stunned silence. It was what was in the center of that space, partially buried by rocks and what appeared to be ancient crystallized snow, was a large and unmistakable metal object, part of an airplane fuselage. "My God," murmured Michael, being the first to recover his voice. "How is this possible? We're more than 6,000 feet in altitude in a cave inside the mountain." David slowly advanced toward the wreckage, his expression a mixture of astonishment and scientific fascination. The visible side of the aircraft showed fragments of a logo faded by time. The metal was corroded and twisted, evidence of a violent impact. "This plane looks familiar," he said, his voice almost a whisper. He took George's diary from the inside pocket of his jacket and quickly leafed through it until he found what he was looking for. "Here it is. George mentions a plane that disappeared in the 80s, Continental Airlines Flight 2731. It disappeared during a storm, without a trace." "How could it have crashed in here?" questioned Sarah, examining the walls of the cave. "There's no opening large enough. It's physically impossible." "Unless the mountain closed around it," suggested Joe, his voice laden with an unsettling certainty. While the group debated the possibilities, Ryan moved away a bit, methodically photographing the wreckage. That's when he noticed something strange on the cave floor. "Guys," he called, pointing his flashlight at the ground. "Look at this." Everyone approached and saw recent human footprints, clearly defined in the fine dust that covered the cave floor. "We've been here for minutes," pointed out Michael, confused. "How did we not notice these footprints before?" "Because they're not ours," replied Sarah, analyzing the marks. "The sole pattern is different from any footwear we're wearing." Collective shiver ran through the group as the implication of that discovery settled in. They were not alone in that cave, or someone had been there very recently. "We need to examine the plane more closely," decided David, already moving toward the wreckage. Using climbing equipment and respecting safety precautions, the group began to carefully explore the aircraft. Parts of the interior were accessible through a large rupture in the fuselage. Inside, they found seats torn from their bases, personal belongings scattered, and clear evidence that the passengers had tried to survive after the impact. Remains of improvised fires, food packaging, and first aid medications. It was Sarah who made the most significant discovery, a partially intact compartment where they found an object carefully wrapped in plastic and waterproof fabric. "It's a diary," she announced, carefully unwrapping the package. It belonged to someone named Morris Layton. With extreme delicacy, she opened the protected notebook. The pages were surprisingly well preserved, written in small, precise handwriting. The first entry was dated September 23, 1989. "The plane crashed during the storm," Sarah read aloud. "We were flying over what the pilot identified as Crystal Ridge when the instruments began to fail. The sky turned blue in the middle of the storm, and then we crashed. Several passengers were injured, but miraculously, no one died. We're in some kind of cave inside the mountain, but no one understands how we got here. There's no visible opening through which a plane of this size could have entered." Sarah turned a few pages, continuing the reading. Day 7. Our watches no longer work. George Sanders, a climber who was on board, believes we're in some kind of geological anomaly. He saw a white goat near a crevice in the cave wall and believes it could be an exit. David visibly paled upon hearing his friend's name. Day 16, continued Sarah, her voice now lower. George and 3 others decided to follow the white goat. They haven't returned. The rest of the group is divided between waiting for rescue or trying the same route. The last entry was confused, the handwriting shaky and hurried. Day 29, I think. It's difficult to maintain a notion of time here. We all dreamed of the same blue tunnel last night. The goat returned and is standing at the entrance of the crevice as if waiting. We have no more supplies. We're going to follow it. If anyone finds this diary, we're alive but not here. Deep silence fell over the group as they absorbed the implications of those words. It was broken by the clear and unmistakable sound of a bell, the same sound that had guided them there. They all turned simultaneously, At the entrance to the crevice through which they had arrived, standing with the same proud and observant posture, was the white goat. The white goat observed them with an almost human intensity, the bell on its neck completely motionless, despite the sound they had all just heard. Its golden eyes reflected the flashlight beams, creating a hypnotic effect. "She wants us to follow her," affirmed Sarah, taking a step toward the animal. "Or she wants to lead us to the same place where George and the other passengers disappeared," warned Michael, holding his colleague's arm. David, who had kept his eyes fixed on the goat since its appearance, finally spoke. "We need to decide. Do we follow the goat or return to camp and wait for dawn to explore this place better?" A heated debate ensued among the group. Michael and Ryan advocated for caution, arguing that any additional exploration should be done in natural light and after communicating their discovery to the university. Sarah, on the other hand, was visibly fascinated by the possibility of unraveling the mystery that had consumed George Sanders. "This could be the greatest scientific discovery of our lives," she argued. "A space-time anomaly inside a mountain. In America. Imagine the implications for physics for our understanding of reality." Joe, who had remained silent throughout the debate, finally spoke up. "The watch goat never takes everyone. She chooses." "What do you mean?" questioned David. "In my grandfather's stories, when a group encounters the watch goat, only some are chosen to see the other side of the veil. The others must wait." "This is ridiculous," protested Michael. "We're talking as if this animal had intelligence and purpose." As if responding directly to the provocation, the goat turned around and walked a few steps toward the crevice through which they had entered the cave. Then it stopped and looked back, in a clear indication that it wished to be followed. "She's calling us," insisted Sarah. "I'm going with her," David suddenly decided. "If George followed this same path, I need to discover what he found." "Professor, this is madness," exclaimed Michael. "Perhaps," admitted David, already checking his equipment. "But I've spent 20 years wondering what happened to my friend. I can't refuse this chance to find out." Sarah immediately positioned herself beside the professor. "I'm going too. I'm a trained climber and can be useful if we encounter difficult terrain." Ryan hesitated, clearly torn between the fear of the unknown and his professional curiosity as a documentarian. "Someone needs to record this," he finally murmured, adjusting his camera. "I'm going too." Michael looked at his three colleagues with exasperation. "Do you realize you're potentially risking your lives because of an animal and an old diary?" "You and Joe can return to camp," suggested David. "If we don't return by dawn, call for help on the base radio." To everyone's surprise, Joe shook his head. "I can't go back alone, Doctor. One of you needs to stay with me." "Why?" questioned Sarah. "Because someone needs to be here when you return." "If you return," replied the guide, his gaze intense and meaningful. "Someone who knows the way back to your world." A heavy silence fell over the group as the implication of those words was absorbed. "Your world," repeated Michael, his voice betraying a tremor of unease. "What exactly are you talking about?" Joe pointed to the goat. "She won't just take you to another place on this mountain. She'll take you beyond the veil, to where time runs differently." "You knew this all along," accused Michael. "You knew you would bring us here." "I didn't know, Doctor," corrected Joe. "I suspected. My grandfather told me stories about people who followed the watch goat. Some returned weeks later without having aged a day. Others were never seen again." The goat emitted a soft sound, almost like a call, and took a few more steps toward the crevice. "She's getting impatient," observed Sarah. "We need to decide now," urged David. "Who's coming with me?" Sarah and Ryan reaffirmed their decision to follow the professor. Michael, after a moment of tormented contemplation, sighed deeply. "I can't let you go alone," he finally declared. "As a doctor, I have responsibility for the team's well-being, but this is against my better judgment." "Then I'll stay," announced Joe. "I'll keep a fire burning and wait for 3 days. If you don't return, I'll head to the village and tell what happened." "And what exactly will you say?" questioned Michael sarcastically. "That we were kidnapped by a magical goat." "I'll tell the truth," replied Joe with simplicity. "That you followed the same path as George Sanders and the others from the plane. Some will understand. David embraced the guide strongly. "Thank you, Joe. We'll be back." "I hope so, Professor," replied the older man, his voice laden with contained emotion. Then, from an inside pocket of his coat, he removed a small stone, amulet with engraved symbols, and gave it to David. "It was my grandfather's. He said it helps find the way back." As the four prepared to follow the goat, checking flashlights and adjusting equipment, Sarah approached Joe. "Is there anything else we should know?" she asked quietly. "Something you haven't told us?" The guide looked into her eyes with a disconcerting intensity. "The watch goat only shows the path, Doctor. The choice to cross the veil is yours and yours alone. Once there, remember, what seems real may not be, and what seems impossible may be the only truth." Before Sarah could ask for more clarification, the goat emitted another sound, this time more urgent, and began to walk toward the crevice. David was the first to follow it, soon accompanied by Ryan, Sarah, and finally, a reluctant Michael. As they moved away, Joe observed with a solemn expression. When they were about to disappear into the passage, the guide made an ancient gesture of protection and murmured words in a dialect that few still knew in the region. "May the veil be gentle with you, and may the guardian bring you back." The crevice through which the group followed the white goat was different from the passage that had led them to the airplane cave. This one progressively narrowed, forcing them to advance in single file, with David in front, followed by Sarah, Ryan, and Michael. The path was illuminated only by the flashlights they carried, creating shadows that danced on the rocky walls like spectral figures. "The goat is getting further away," observed Sarah, quickening her pace so as not to lose sight of the animal, whose white fur reflected the light with supernatural intensity. The further they advanced, the stranger the sensations became. The air seemed denser, filled with an aroma reminiscent of unknown flowers and ozone. The sounds of their footsteps echoed peculiarly, as if they were in a much larger space than the narrow passage suggested. "Do you feel that?" asked Ryan, his voice slightly trembling. "It's like a vibration in the air." They could all feel it, a subtle pulsation that seemed to emanate from the very rocks around them, gradually increasing as they proceeded. The flashlights began to flicker, the light oscillating in synchrony with the strange vibration. "The equipment is failing again," warned Michael, checking the electronic devices. "GPS totally out, compass going crazy." David, who was following determinedly despite the warning signs, suddenly stopped, causing the others to collide slightly behind him. "Look ahead," he whispered, his voice a mixture of astonishment and reverence. Just a few yards ahead, the narrow passage ended abruptly, opening into something that defied comprehension. It wasn't another cave, nor the exterior of the mountain. It was a space where reality itself seemed distorted, as if the air were rippling in impossible patterns, colored by shades of blue that pulsed rhythmically. The white goat stood at the boundary between the rocky passage and that indefinable space, its golden eyes fixed on the group as if assessing their determination. "The veil," murmured Sarah, remembering Joe's words. "We're before the veil." As they watched, paralyzed, the goat moved with deliberate grace, crossing the rippling boundary. For a brief instant, its form seemed to split into multiple overlapping versions of itself, before solidifying again on the other side. There, it turned and waited like a silent invitation. "It's fascinating," murmured David, stepping forward, his scientific curiosity overcoming any fear. "It looks like some kind of distortion in the space-time fabric itself." "Professor, I think we should reconsider," warned Michael, holding David's arm. "This goes beyond any known geological anomaly or atmospheric phenomenon. We're facing something that modern science cannot explain." "Or facing the opportunity to expand the limits of that science," countered Sarah, already positioned beside David. Ryan silently adjusted his camera, determined to document whatever he was about to witness. "George was here," affirmed David, his eyes fixed on the blue ripple. "He crossed over, I'm sure, and now I understand why he never returned, or perhaps he returned to a different time than ours." "This is madness," murmured Michael, although his voice no longer carried the same conviction. "I'm going to cross." decided David. "Whoever comes with me should be aware. We don't know what's on the other side, nor if we can return." Without waiting for a response, he stepped forward, crossing the rippling boundary. For a moment, his figure distorted, as if being viewed through moving water, before recomposing on the other side. He turned to his companions, his face illuminated by a blue light that seemed to emanate from the entire environment around him. "It's incredible." His voice sounded strangely distant, despite being just a few yards away. "Come and see." Sarah didn't hesitate, following him with characteristic determination. Ryan, after a brief moment of hesitation, was next, his camera raised, recording every second of the crossing. Michael remained behind, his face a mask of internal conflict. "This goes against everything I've learned," he murmured to himself. But seeing his 3 colleagues on the other side, next to the goat that still awaited them, he made his decision. With a deep sigh, he crossed the rippling boundary. The sensation was impossible to adequately describe. It was like diving into warm water and electricity at the same time, each cell of the body vibrating at a different frequency, while the perception of space and time momentarily dissolved. When the sensation passed and Michael could look around, astonishment left him speechless. They were on a vast plateau at the top of the mountain, but it wasn't the crystal ridge they knew. The sky above them had an impossible blue-violet coloration, dotted with stars visible even during what appeared to be daytime. The vegetation around was familiar and strange at the same time, plants reminiscent of ridge species, but with more vibrant colors and slightly altered forms. Even more surprising was the distant landscape. Plains extended beyond the plateau, dotted with floating rock formations, literally suspended in the air, defying gravity with their impossible existence. "Where are we?" asked Michael, his voice almost a whisper. "The correct question might be, 'When are we?'" replied David, his eyes scanning the horizon with scientific fascination. "Or even, in which version of reality are we?" The white goat, which had been waiting patiently, began to walk along a natural trail that contoured the plateau. Its bell now emitted a clear sound with each step, as if it had been activated by crossing the veil. "She wants us to follow her," observed Sarah, already adjusting her equipment for the hike. "That's what we've been doing so far, isn't it?" commented Ryan with a nervous smile, checking his camera, which surprisingly worked on this side of reality. The group followed the goat for approximately half an hour, walking in silence, each absorbing the strangeness and beauty of the surrounding environment. Small animals similar to hummingbirds, but with wings that seemed made of crystal, occasionally crossed their path. Luminescent insects pulsed at the edges of the trail. It was when they rounded a large rock formation that they saw an unorganized camp near a small crystalline lake of turquoise-blue waters. Modern tents and some more rustic shelters formed a semicircle facing the water. People moved between the structures, apparently involved in daily tasks. Michael halted, incredulous. There are people living here." "The survivors of the plain," murmured David, his voice trembling with emotion. The camp was larger than it appeared at first sight. As they approached, guided by the white goat that walked ahead with serene steps, the group realized that the community was surprisingly organized. There were small cultivated gardens, structures for water collection, and even an energy system that seemed to function with bluish crystals similar to those they had seen on the walls of the cave. A woman of approximately 60, graying hair, tied in a long braid, was the first to notice them. Her eyes widened in surprise and recognition, not of their specific identities, but the immediate perception that they were visitors from the other side. "The watch goat has brought new ones," she announced, her clear voice cutting through the air. Several people interrupted their activities and turned to observe the newcomers. A tall, thin man with a well-trimmed white beard approached quickly. There was something familiar in his wrinkled face, but marked by a serenity that seemed to transcend time. "Welcome to the refuge," he said with a warm smile. "I'm George Sanders, and you must be very confused." David was paralyzed, as if he had seen a ghost. The George before him looked at least 20 years older than he should be, considering the time since his disappearance. "George?" David's voice faltered. "It's me, David. David Miller." The older man's face lit up in genuine recognition. "David? My God, you look exactly the same." He approached, studying his friend's face with amazement. "How many years have passed?" "Out there." 20 years, replied David, his voice choked with emotion. "You disappeared 20 years ago." George shook his head, marveling. "For me, it's been almost 40. The astonishment was palpable among the four visitors. Sarah was the first to recover her scientific composure. "Time flows differently here. Faster?" "Not exactly," explained George, gesturing for them to follow him toward the camp. "Time here is flexible. It flows differently for each person, depending on when they crossed the veil and how their body and mind adapted to the reality on this side." As they walked, other people approached, curious but respectful. There were about 30 individuals in total, of different ages and ethnicities. Some seemed to have arrived recently, while others demonstrated the same ethereal quality that George emanated, a kind of inner peace that seemed to radiate from within. "Are they all survivors of the plane crash?" asked Michael, his clinical gaze discreetly assessing the apparent health of the group. "Most of them," confirmed George. "Others are hikers, explorers, or locals who found the Vale over the years, and some were born here." "Born here?" repeated Ryan, surprised. George smiled, pointing to a young woman tending to crystalline plants in the garden. "My daughter, Claire. Her mother was a nurse on Flight 2731. We fell in love during the first years here. Claire was born and grew up never having known the other side." They arrived at a larger structure that served as a common area. Comfortable cushions arranged in a circle allowed everyone to sit. The white goat which had guided them there lay down calmly near the entrance like a silent sentinel. "You must have thousands of questions," said George, sitting down. "I'll try to answer what I can, but there's much in this place that remains a mystery, even after so many years." The following hours were filled with explanations that defied conventional science. George described how the group of survivors had followed the watchgoat through the Vale, seeking an exit from the cave where the plane had inexplicably crashed. What they found was a parallel realm where the laws of physics functioned with slight differences. "At first we thought we were in some kind of collective hallucination," he explained, "but the hunger was real, the thirst was real, we needed to survive. Over time, we discovered that this place, which we simply call the refuge, is incredibly generous to those who respect it." "And you never tried to return?" asked Sarah. A shadow of sadness crossed George's face. "We tried in the early years. Some managed to cross back through the Vale, but we never knew if they really returned to the world we knew or to some other version of reality. Others," he hesitated, "others simply disappeared in the attempt." As the sun, slightly more bluish than Earth's, began to set, the group was introduced to other inhabitants of the refuge. Maurice Layton, the author of the diary they had found, in the cave, was now an elderly man who served as a kind of historian for the community. Hannah Brandon, the ex-nurse and George's wife, coordinated medical care, utilizing local plants with surprising properties. "The most extraordinary thing," explained George as they dined on locally grown food, "is that no one gets sick here. Injuries heal faster. Chronic pains disappear over time. It's as if the place regenerates us somehow." "That would explain why you look so healthy despite your advanced age," observed Michael with medical interest. The night progressed, and the visitors were accommodated in a tent, specially prepared for them. Before retiring, George took David by the arm, leading him to a more private location. "You came looking for me," he stated, "not as a question but as a fact." "I never believed you had simply disappeared," replied David. "Your last messages about the blue light and the goat, I spent years researching similar phenomena, trying to understand." George smiled with affection. "Some mysteries aren't meant to be completely understood, but experienced." Then his expression became more serious. "You need to decide, and soon. The Vale doesn't remain open indefinitely for newcomers. In 3 sun cycles, what would be 3 days for you, it will close. If you stay beyond that time, You'll become a permanent part of the refuge, like all of us." "That means we can return?" asked David, his mind rapidly processing the implications. "You can try," replied George cautiously. "The watchgoat shows the way to both sides, but the crossing back carries its own risks. And there's another thing I need to mention." He hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "Time flows differently here, but that difference isn't constant. I can't guarantee at what moment you'll return, should you choose to leave." The next morning the group gathered to discuss their situation. Michael and Ryan strongly inclined toward returning, while Sarah was fascinated by the possibility of studying an ecosystem literally from another world. David was torn. He had found his lost friend, but had responsibilities and ties on the other side. "We need to decide together," insisted Sarah. "Whatever the choice, we should be united." After hours of discussion, they reached a consensus. They would return, taking with them detailed scientific records of the refuge. George, upon learning of the decision, showed understanding. "I would do the same at your age," he admitted. "There's much still to live, but you'll take something from here that will never leave you, the certainty that reality is vaster and more mysterious than current science can explain." On the morning of departure, the entire community gathered to say goodbye. George gave David a necklace with a bluish crystal, to remember that there are other worlds beyond those we know, and a diary containing scientific observations from 40 years in the refuge. The white goat awaited them on the trail that led to the crossing point. They followed it in silence, each absorbed in thoughts about the extraordinary experience they had shared. The veil was still there, rippling in shades of blue, like a translucent curtain between two realities. The goat crossed first, its body momentarily fragmenting into multiple versions before recomposing on the other side. "Together," said David, extending his hands. The four intertwined their fingers and, with one last look at the refuge, stepped forward, plunging into the blue ripple. The sensation of crossing was as disconcerting as the first time, like simultaneous dissolution and reconstruction of being. When they finally emerged on the other side, they found themselves in the same rocky crevice they had entered. In the distance, they saw the light of a campfire, Joe faithfully keeping his promise to wait. The guide jumped to his feet upon seeing them emerge from the darkness. "You're back!" he exclaimed with genuine joy, embracing each one. "How much time passed there?" 3 days, replied Michael, still disoriented. Joe frowned, confused. 3 days, but you left just a few hours ago. The sun has barely risen since you left." They exchanged perplexed looks. Time really did flow differently beyond the veil. On the journey back to civilization, each processed the experience in their own way. Ryan discovered that his photos of the refuge had come out perfectly clear, tangible proof of their adventure. Michael had collected samples of plants with potentially revolutionary medicinal properties. Sarah brought detailed notes about the fauna and flora of that parallel world. And David carried the greatest treasure of all, the certainty that his friend was alive and at peace, and the scientific knowledge contained in George's diary, which promised to revolutionize fields ranging from physics to biology. Months later, gathered on the porch of David's house in Portland, the four conversed about how the experience had transformed their lives and careers. Sarah and Michael had begun a scientific collaboration to study the samples brought back, while Ryan prepared a carefully edited photographic exhibition to not reveal too much. "The strangest thing," commented David, observing the sunset over the Columbia River, "is that sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night I could swear I hear the sound of a bell, like the one the watchgoat carried." The others nodded in silence, for all had experienced similar sensations. Fleeting moments when the boundary between worlds seemed thinned, reminding them that the veil was always there for those who knew where to look. That night, after his friends departed, David remained alone in his office, contemplating the bluish crystal George had given him. Under certain light, he could almost see landscapes within it, reflections of the refuge perhaps, or just manifestations of his own memory. On his desk, George's diary lay open to a specific page, where an underlined phrase seemed to glow with renewed meaning. The limits between worlds exist only in the mind of those who never dared to cross them. Smiling, David closed the diary and turned off the light. Some mysteries didn't need to be completely understood.